we are not going to escape loss ever in our lives. I think that it's a contract we make with life, that we're going to live despite the certainty of loss.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Say Again with me, Amrita Tripathi. I'm delighted in this episode to bring us a new guest and a new conversation. This is with a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist, Bakul Dua, someone who has lived experience and dealt with their own share of mental health challenges. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about what it means to have, mental health come in to the conversation, not just in a silo, but of course, across the board for many of us here in India. Bakul, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Thank you, Amrita. Delighted to be here.
So, one of the things I want to ask you, is literally where we stand in 2024. You've been working in this field for many, many years. But even today in 2024, what would be one myth you think that still persists when it comes to mental health?
Right. So I've been working in the field for about 16, 17 years. And back when I started, which wasn't very long ago, but in mental health time, it's a long ago. Um, it was mental health was not a buzzword back then. It was still unusual for people to choose mental health as a career path, and it wasn't a buzzword. It wasn't fancy to talk about it. And at that time, the nature of myths we used to encounter most frequently were around stigma, were around mental illness is weakness, or around black magic, curses, a slightly more sort of superstitious lens of viewing mental illness. Cut to like 15, 16 years later, I think because there's so much awareness now, at least in one section of India, um, the more common sort of myth that I find, which is very problematic, is the belief that mental illness or mental health work is equivalent to fixing the individual without looking at what's happening in the world around, looking at the social context, looking at what's happening culturally, politically, historically, looking at the person in isolation and believing that therapy is some sort of clinical fix for the individual mind. And mental health is not about fixing an individual. It's not about fixing in any case, but it's not at all an individual problem. Mental health, mental illness, looking at psychological health and wellness in general, we have to look at the systems around us. We have to look at the way society is structured, at power relations in society. No individual can experience mental well-being in an unwell society, in a society that's unequal, in a society that's exploitative, in a society that is that kind of is you know just multiple historical cleavages around class, caste, and
Yeah.
so many other intersections. So I think the biggest myth still is go to a therapist. Therapist will give you some tools and tricks, and you'll fix your mind, and then you can go about fitting yourself in a absolutely complex, messed up world. So yeah, I think that's the biggest myth.
That's really interesting because that does also take the onus away from just trying to fix the individual, as you're saying, looking at the system, looking at the systemic biases and challenges and intersectional issues
Yeah.
that exist. Can I ask you a little bit about, before we delve into grief, which is something we've been looking at, at the Health Collective very deeply, and there's sort of a personal and professional journey there as well. But as somebody you say who's had lived experience, to choose a field like you have, can you tell us a little bit about your own journey there?
Yeah. This is, like I said to you before we started, this is an identity in a story that I've not always been very comfortable to claim. And it started way back when I had joined the first year of college. And I think that's when I started to notice mental health becoming a bit of an issue for me. And I experienced very, very intense depression, very intense anxiety. Uh, I think navigated my challenges with a lot of substance and drug use back then, and didn't have a vocabulary to understand it, but eventually found myself, eventually found my way to a psychiatrist's clinic, and found my first therapist, found got my first dose of medication. I'm still on it. It's been 17 years, and I can't deal without it. But I think what happened through the journey of my own therapy, through the journey of understanding my own sort of experience with mental illness, I realized that this is something that I feel very drawn towards, very naturally drawn towards going deeper into as a profession. And the organization I worked with, Sarthak, was actually kind enough to give me an opportunity to join them as an intern, join them as a volunteer. And that's where the journey really started. But over the years, I chose to edit this story. I wasn't very comfortable claiming lived experience as a professional, because you
Mm.
know what happens. I think you try to dissociate yourself from your vulnerability and move towards expertise, towards towards saying that, okay, now I'm the doctor, I'm the biomedical expert, and you live the story of being the invulnerable expert, right? And I think that the pursuit of degrees, the pursuit of knowledge, going and getting trained, I think there was an unconscious pressure and bias towards clinicians being resilient. There was a need for clinicians to be unbiased and objective and not have too much, not be too messy as humans, right? I think that times are changing now. Training institutes, training contexts are now really acknowledging that people are wounded healers. People can bring their own history of vulnerability with them, and that's not a barrier. In fact, that's only something that enriches the work that they do. And I think because there's that permission now to talk about it, I'm able to now go back and tell people that actually the way I came into mental health is not through a degree in psychology. I got my degree in psychology at the age of 30. I got into mental health first as a user survivor myself, and I'm now kind of comfortable saying that story. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, it's also unusual to hear with so much candor, but as you're saying, I mean, we are seeing things change even in India, where people are
Yeah.
understanding also the need to center around lived experience. Not necessarily just from the professional point of view, but just in terms of people's journeys and getting help. I really appreciate your sharing that with us, and I'm sure that it's an asset when you're working, with folks as you do. I'm sure it can only help because you understand, what it means to live with a condition, and what it takes to cope. I do want to ask you, Bakul, a little bit about. I'm going to pop this question on empathy. I'm not going to, I'm going to contextualize it a little bit more about when we talk to folks, especially nowadays. I'm at the stage where I'm very interested in how people show up for each other. How do people
Hmm.
show up as leaders, as allies? When we understand that almost everyone, we barely know things about people we work with, or everybody's dealing with something, and I think that empathy is something that's come up, compassion is something that's come up. I do want to ask you, how critical do you think that is, for anyone listening to this, for example, whatever the walk of life they may be, how important do you think is it, as adults especially, to be centering around empathy or compassion?
Yeah, I do first want to acknowledge that this is an extremely important question, not only for therapists, but I'd say anybody working in any profession, in any relationship. I don't think skills like empathy, skills like emotional intelligence, skills like being able to listen, hold space, are socially and culturally socially and culturally encouraged and nurtured in young children. I'm going to start right from there. I think coping is a skill that we're very good with. Beating into children, dealing with things, moving on, getting on with it, are things that we are very good as a culture indoctrinating. But empathy, and I think empathy, at the first instance, I think it requires just being able to slow down, just being able to slow down, pause, and acknowledge that what you may believe about someone is only your belief. Your reality and the other person's reality may be very different, and you may carry a worldview that may not be the worldview of another person. And so, empathy begins by questioning our own assumptions about people, about relationships, about imposing our template of the world on another, about imposing our stereotypes and our scripts and stories on other people. But empathy, actually, I think the first step of empathy is to pause and acknowledge that we are all living out only our stories, and that's a very limited lens. And empathy starts with a willingness to be corrected, a willingness to be compassionately curious. Empathy cannot exist where there's judgment. So if I've already made a judgment that, oh, this person, she's always doing this for attention. I think one of the commonest kind of judgments we have about mental health, for example, that becomes a barrier to empathy is attention seeking. for example. And I think when you take an empathic stance, you're willing to suspend that for a moment. I don't think we can ever stop being judgmental, but you're willing to bracket it, park it, acknowledge it, and say, well, this is coming from me and my experiences and how I've been told, uh, how I've been spoken to. But let me ask this person and let me be willing to learn and be corrected. Empathy also, I think, demands that you allow emotions to have a seat at the table. In an increasingly sort of late stage capitalist world, it's very dangerous and worrisome for people to have emotions have a seat at the table, because it would come in the way of productivity. Emotions are associated with feminine principles, and it goes against the very late stage capitalist masculinity with which we're supposed to just push at things. So it's a very doing mode, and empathy is about being, right? Empathy is about slowing down and being. And that's something that we, in the culture that we are in the sort of socio-political climate we're in, we're a very doing culture. Slowing down, allowing ourselves to be playful, allowing ourselves to really just listen without the need to rush to make meaning, rush to build a model. I think empathy means allowing someone to make meaning of their situation the way they would like to, right? And allowing them the slowness and time to be able to do that.
That's
Yeah,
fascinating, and I love also how you said it's a skill, because it's not something, and I didn't realize this. Obviously it is a skill because it's not something we're born with. It's something
absolutely.
you can choose to exercise, you can choose to learn, as it were.
Yeah. It's actually a relational experience. So you experience empathy first in the context of your earliest childhood relationships, your earliest caregivers, if you're lucky. If they're empathetic with you, if they're able to tune into what's happening to you as a child, as a baby, even, right? A baby cannot make sense of their own mind. A baby doesn't have a sense of uh, their own mind and their own emotion. But a mother, a father, or any kind of caregiver that tunes into their emotion shows it on their face. Oh, you got hurt? There's that exaggerated expression. And then the baby starts to develop a sense of their own mind, a theory of mind. And if we are constantly exposed to this repeated cycle of being empathized with, our experiences and emotions being made sense of, being contained, and then kind of returned to us in a way that, okay, there, it's dealable. We can make sense of this. It's okay. So the more we experience empathy, I think the more we can also find it in our own being. Having said that, people can also build empathy. But the first step towards building empathy is to finding the barriers in yourself towards having an empathic stance towards individuals and towards people. And I think stereotypes are one barrier, scripts and stories and shoulds are one barrier. All the rules we've internalized about how people should be, how things should be, how the world should be, how someone should behave, how strength should look like, the shoulds and scripts, I think, are the most important barriers that we need to consider. Yeah, I think the learning
That's
of empathy. I also think seeking feedback. We're not a very, I don't think a lot of us are very comfortable checking back with people how we're doing in relationship with them. Empathy grows and expands the more feedback you seek from people. And I think the more safety people experience in experiencing feedback, and I think I'm largely talking about workplaces right now. Feedback
yeah.
can tend to be so unsafe that people's defenses go up, and there's no way to then uh, take in perspective. But for leaders, especially in workplaces, it's very, very important to allow yourself to be corrected, to allow
Yeah.
emotions to have a seat at the table, to know that your worldview is just one worldview. uh, yeah, I think those are some
That's
ideas
super
that I've
helpful.
got.
And I think that that's super helpful for all of us, as you said, whatever the workplace, and wherever we are in our own journeys. That's really helpful for us to think through. We'll take a short break here. We'll be talking to Buckle about much more coming up, including grief, how to cope, and what are some things you might want to know. This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Health Collective. The Health Collective is a safe space for credible information on mental health and mental illness from an India lens. Our website is healthcollective.in, and you can find us on Instagram at Health Collective India, as well as on YouTube. Use the handle at Health Collective. We'd love to hear more from you. You'll find stories of lived experience, as well as comics, art, expert columns, and much more on the Health Collective. So we're talking to Bakul about many different things that come up when we think about mental health, and not just in a silo. Because of course, Bakul, one of the things I learned when I started working, in this space as a journalist and storyteller, is that we all have mental health. And one of the things that really feels like it should be a headline every day is that we need to take care of our own mental health.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you a little bit about something. At the Health Collective, we've been talking to folks about grief and bereavement and loss. And I think it's a difficult topic because, for many reasons, which I will ask you as well to weigh in on. It's one of those things which I feel more people need to be equipped to cope, to know how to help friends and family and loved ones cope. And yet we're most of us, left stranded and at sea. And it's only when we lose someone we love, we realize that we don't have the vocabulary, we may not have the, coping skills or strategies, and we don't really know how to be there for each other. Can I ask you for your take, just, off the bat, how important is it for us to learn these coping skills? And what would you say to someone who's recently suffered a bereavement or loss?
Um, so I have a complex take on this, coming both from my having navigated it personally and having worked with people professionally who've navigated grief. And I think for this particular conversation, I'm going to stand with my position of my own lived experience with grief. I feel like that's a more authentic position. It's a position that feels more honest to me. I think books have always failed when it comes to teaching me how to grieve or supporting my clients with grief. So I'm going to just occupy the position of lived experience here. And I think from right off the bat, let's just acknowledge that loss, the fact of loss, is inseparable from the human condition, right? It's a fact of being alive, and every single human will continuously, at some point or the other, will lose the people that they love, pets, jobs, countries, ideas. We lose parts of ourselves. We lose parts. The life that we thought we would have, we may lose it through death, we may lose it through divorce, we may lose our health, we may lose relationships. But loss is an inescapable part of life. So when there is a tendency to medicalize grief or to pathologize grief or to kind of offer quick fixes to deal with it, I think my first response to that is we are not going to escape loss ever in our lives. I think that it's a contract we make with life, that we're going to live despite the certainty of loss. Grief or grieving is the emotional or psychological pain of loss, right? And it's absolutely natural. It's a universal response to loss. The complex and intense wave of emotions that we feel after we've experienced a loss is not abnormal, is not a medical condition. It's not something that you necessarily need to be therapized out of or medicated out of. It's not necessarily also something that we can straight away cope with, and it's certainly not something that happens in stages. So I think most people's understanding of grief, at least academically, theoretically, comes from Kubler-Ross's stages. For one, Kubler-Ross was talking about the interviews she'd done with people who were dying. So those stages came from not people who were bereaved, but from people who were experiencing terminal illness, right? So that aside, grief absolutely does not happen in linear stages, right? In fact, if anything, grief is a very complicated mix. There's nothing stage like about it. For example, I think I today can hold anger, guilt, and acceptance, and a part of me can hold denial about the grief about the losses that I've experienced. So instead of looking at it as stages, maybe you can look at it through the language of parts. There's a part of me that's beginning to or growing to accept or is on the journey to acceptance, but there's a part of me that's never going to stop being angry about what happened. And then there's a part of me that feels that that's spiritually connected to the experience of loss and makes meaning of it by saying, all right, things happen the way they had to, and there's a part of me that can surrender to it. So I think this push and this pressure to have a single story or a single way of coping with loss, I think is very counterproductive. People should be allowed to have multiple stories and multiple paths within themselves that are having a conversation with each other internally about what grief and loss means to them. I think that it's very important not to pressure yourself to anesthetize grief, because grieving is the way you make sense of loss. If we were to cut short that process or to anesthetize it or to cut it off or to numb ourselves, I think the arc of grief, and I think there is an arc of grief, even though it's not a linear arc. There is an arc of grief. We eventually get to a point where life starts to grow bigger than grief. I don't think the grief gets smaller necessarily, but life starts to grow around it, and we start to being able to carry it a little better. But we have to allow the process to happen. So I think anyone who feels very helpless about watching someone they know grieve and tries to get them to offer, tries to offer platitudes like it happened for the best, or they're not suffering now, or you must move on now. There is no short circuit. There is absolutely no short circuit to grief. In fact, it's not very healthy to short circuit grief. It's a non-linear process. It's complex. It's only when we go through the emotions that grief brings in that we can actually move. We can move. I'm not going to say move ahead, but we can move through our grief. Yeah.
What, that's one of the things I realized. And I lost my father several years ago, and I do realize, as you say, that your life grows around it. It doesn't actually get smaller, because there'll be moments that will come and
Yeah.
throw you, and they may be completely tangential memories. And you do start to see it as a, I think, the impact of having loved, and as you said, it's a contract we make with life
Absolutely.
almost, right? That this is
Absolutely.
going to happen. But I remember that point, for my mother, certainly, for me, sometimes when people would say things like, you have to be strong now, you have to be the strong one now. And, I can't believe it's been a year. I mean, it's been 7 years now.
Yeah.
And I would never tell someone, you should move on. It's been a year, it's been 2 years. But these are things people say, and I know they mean well, but it can really enrage you in the moment. There's no getting around it. So can I ask you a little bit about, what are some of the things that it may be helpful to say, do, not do? As you said, when you're seeing someone you love go through this process, understanding that they have to go through it.
Yeah.
But what are some things we might want to, like, just not say, not do?
Right. Um, don't try to fix it. Nothing can fix grief. Allow yourself to sit with that complex, messy pain, right? If you're able to sit with it, hold it, without feeling the urge to fix it, you'll say the right things. I think what you say only comes from the internal position that you've found yourself in. So if at some point you feel like you need them to get over it, or you feel like grief can be fixed, I think maybe reflect on that. Definitely don't offer platitudes, right? I'm there for you. It's we should move on now. This was God's will. He's not suffering anymore. Uh, they will come back in another form, or these platitudes that culturally that have been kind of transmitted to us. Um, they offer only peace to the person who's using them, not to the person who's receiving them. I think that what has helped me is the permission to grieve messily, right? People I felt safe enough to ugly cry with, and ugly cry repeatedly. People I've also felt safe enough to laugh hysterically about my grief with, right? People who allow me to retain the complexity of my grief. People offering practical support, just coming and just taking my baby from me for a couple of hours so that I can crash and sleep or cry, or coming and just staying with me for a few days, offering to help with chores, right? I think practical support goes a long way. The thing that people most often miss is that people rally around you in the initial days a lot, right? The first months, the first weeks, the first 2 months or so, you're surrounded, and you may not feel very isolated in your grief. Actually, because grief comes in waves and there's a life cycle of grief also, I found that it's typically around the 4 month 6 month mark that people feel utterly lonely and isolated in their grief, because the acute phase has kind of passed. People have sort of got on with their lives. That's when you start to really feel the pangs of isolation, and you start to isolate yourself, because there's a societal expectation that you should have gotten over it by now. You shouldn't be carrying it with you all the time. Why is she still grieving? Why is he still grieving? Right? There's that unconscious sort of expectation that people should have moved on by now. And that's also when people start to move away. You find yourself very lonely and isolated. So if you are dealing with someone, if you are sort of supporting someone who's bereaved or who's grieving, make sure not to sort of bombard them with support only in the early months. Check on check in with them more constantly, more consistently. Don't assume that they've stopped grieving. I think what's always helped me is people remembering that I will continue to grieve for the rest of my life, right? So even touching base with me about something that they remembered about my parents or my cousin or my aunt, all of whom I lost, just checking in, reminder about them. I think it's reassuring that people acknowledge this is a part of your life forever, but you may not be reduced to it, right? That's not all of you, but it's a enduring part of you. I think that the most one of the best books that I've read on grief is It's Okay That It's Not Okay, or It's Okay to Not Be Okay, by Megan Devine or Devine. And she goes against this grain of saying we have to fix grief. We don't have to fix grief. It's an enduring connection to the person we've lost, and it's okay to hold on to that connection. I think it gives life a profound sense of meaning, a profound sense of purpose also sometimes. I know that grief is very central. My relationship with my parents in the other world, or whatever they are now, is very central to my identity, to my life story, to the direction that my life has taken. And I would take it very, very negatively if someone asked me to move on. I feel like it's only deepened my life in a way, this experience of loss and this new connection with them. um, I think in a way
Yeah.
has really deeply enriched my life. They're part of my life story even now, and they will continue to be till I'm alive. So
I love that. I hope they listen to this. I mean, I said our
yes,
parents knew each other, and I feel like that it's such a wonderful connection. Even though we're connecting now,
yes,
many years after that. But thank you for sharing that. I do wonder though sometimes because uh, Bakul, I want to come back to what is it about, it's okay for you and me to sit here and have this chat in a way, it's sort of a curated conversation. We've both dealt with, bereavement in our own ways, and we're able to now, somewhere in our journey where we can talk. At some point, people, of course, look to you as the expert, which doesn't happen with me. I feel like at one point I became like the town crier, because I think in the immediate aftermath of losing, my father and then a friend, I was like, we have no time. You need to really focus on the here
yes.
and now, and no one wants to hear that. Firstly, as a heads up to anyone listening, no one wants you to be the the Cassandra of like doom. But why is it then, do you think, that we are so uncomfortable? Like, we prepare for so many other things in life, right? Like, we are constantly being told, as you said, from childhood on up, how to cope with things, get on with things, move on with things. Why is this such a difficult topic to discuss sort of calmly? And is it just because it's our own pending mortality, or it's something that's so uncomfortable because we just want to shun the whole conversation unless we've had to deal with it
Yeah,
ourselves?
I think I agree with you. It's I think it's easy to deny the mortality of our own being and of the ones we love. I think as human beings, we thrive on the delusion of control, on the fact that over centuries, over millennia, we've been able to conquer and overpower everything, right? And death remains that one certainty that we have absolutely no control over, nothing. It brings us to our knees as a narcissistic race, as a narcissistic species, right? This is something we have absolutely no control over. It shatters. You don't just lose the person that you love or the experience that you were close to. It shatters completely your worldview, the ground that you stand on. And I think it's very difficult to talk about it because words don't quite capture how colossal that just how profound and how colossal that shift is. I think for the longest time I could not speak to my therapist about grief either. I didn't think that she, who's been with me for years, could understand it, because all it existed as was just sensations in the body, or images, or drawings. I could draw my grief, I could move my grief, I could feel my grief. I did not have the words. I think that it is something that's fundamentally transcends words. I think it is something that even when people think about talk therapy or talking to people, I found that silence is something that's helped me more than words have. I think movement is something that has helped me more than imposing meaning on grief. I do think that a large part of grief is difficult. Death and dying are difficult to capture in words, but I think that there needs to be an alternate vocabulary which is beyond words, right? And I think many different cultures have attempted to develop an idiom of death, dying, grief through art, through dance. I do think those are more powerful mediums to experience our shared connection around death, dying, and grief than just words alone. I've actually found that words have failed terrifically when it comes to that. So one is, I think, this the absolute lack of control we have in the face of death and dying. And we actually spend a lot of time trying to overcome it, right? from anti-aging to that man who's trying to be young and not die, Brian Johnson, to I think the terror that we hold about death and dying is something that we've been actively trying to sort of work against, trying to defend ourselves from. But the reality is that death is constantly, we're we're holding death's hand all the time, right? And I think in a way death becomes context of life itself. It's like a perimeter of life. I think it allows us to connect with our own finiteness, our own smallness. I think also with the absolutely bizarre um, contract that we have with life, right? That I think that a lot of people are afraid of death. At least I've sort of, the conversations I've had with clients, the conversations I've had with my own therapist, people who are most terrified of dying are also the people who are most terrified of being alive. There is being alive is extremely terrifying, because I mean, imagine all that you could do with this life that you have and all that won't. So
Yeah.
I think that you can't talk about death without talking about life, and you can't talk about life without talking about death. And I think
Yeah.
they're kind of interconnected. And it's like it's those polarities that are never inseparable. So yeah,
Yeah. And the funny thing is, we're all terrified of dying ourselves, but what we don't realize is we should be terrified of losing people we love. That's a very morbid and dark conversation. But it does remind me that life is absurd, also, right? I mean, you have to learn how to laugh about
absolutely,
these things. And
absolutely.
learn how
I
to
think
live.
that nothing helped me more than stopping trying to find meaning in what happened. What grief,
Yeah.
loss is for the most part meaningless. I kept trying to impose a
Yeah.
story, a script, a linear journey, some sort of sense, some beauty, something poetic around the story of my grief and the story of people that I work with. And sometimes it's okay to just say this is just bloody bizarre. uh, nothing
Yeah.
of this makes sense, and I think I'm going to surrender to this part, and I'm going to try and control the things that I do have control over. I think the one place that and I'm kind of just slowing down and bringing a trigger warning here for listeners, because I'll be talking about supporting someone who may be experiencing ideas of death and dying, or in clinical parlance called someone who's suicidal. But someone who's contemplating death and dying is particularly a challenge for people to support, primarily for this reason, Amrita, that I think we always feel like it's our need, or it's our responsibility to talk them out of wanting to die. And that's where most suicide prevention work sort of fails. One, because we assume that you could talk a person out of the wish to die without really changing what's happening around them. So suicide is sort of a complex, multifaceted, systemic issue, for one. But as far as talking to people who are contemplating death and dying is concerned, I think that we have such strong opinions about the need to prevent suicide, right? Rather than connecting with people to understand the part of them that's holding pain, and the part of them that wishes to extinguish that pain. And to acknowledge that there could be a part of them that would want to live, but without the pain, right? So again, that language of parts is really helpful. Especially I think in with mental health professionals, this is a risk that we encounter very much. We're taught these very traditional DSM led crisis risk assessment systems. So you identify high risk, moderate risk, low risk, and then you kind of force yourself on the individual, and you try to talk them out of it, and you say things like, but life is beautiful, and don't you want to live for this person or that person. I think even as mental health professionals, or as people supporting someone who's contemplating death and dying, we are so uncomfortable with the idea that someone could have a part within them that wishes not to be alive anymore, that we want to talk them out of it. And I think that actually pushes people further away from us. I think to be able to really sit with the person who wants to articulate the need to not feel the pain anymore. At many points in time, people have told me that the option that I have to actually put an end to everything sometimes gives me solace. And the fact that you're able to listen to me without judging me, or without trying to teach me to say, no, no, don't say that, but you're supposed to be strong, or but you're supposed to move on, but you're supposed to be resilient. Sometimes people just need the permission to be able to articulate this sort of desire to contemplate death and dying. And I think many of
Yeah.
us rush too soon to kind of judge, especially I'm talking about people in the mental health profession. There's a need to convince people to what. But I think
Yeah.
what we forget is to hold space for the parts of them that wish to that wish to express the absolute despair that life has brought,
Yeah.
and sometimes articulating that, and that meeting with a sensitive response to say, I get it, I can't, I haven't experienced it, but I get why you would feel this way. Sometimes that itself makes people feel like, okay, you know what, wow, this overwhelming wave that I've felt is, it's not abnormal, it's not pathological. I'm not isolated and alone in my grief, in my wish to think about dying. So yeah, I think we moved to, yeah.
Yeah. And it's such a common. I mean, we've worked on this book with Dr. Patari and Dr. Nadkarni called
Hmm.
Life Interrupted, looking at
Yeah.
India's suicide crisis. And I started doing some of this reporting, I realized that it's so common with young Indians. The leading cause of death for young Indians of a
Yeah.
certain age group, and we don't talk about it, as you said, because it's uncomfortable. I think certainly in the profession you're in, but also triple that,
Absolutely.
maybe quadruple that
Yeah.
exponentially for lay people. Who are listening to this who might be feeling distressed or triggered, please know that help is available. We have helplines up on healthcollective.co.in/contact. You'll find helplines online, Indian helplines as well. So please know that you're not alone. I want to ask you one more thing about that, Bakul, because the other thing is when you look at bereavement and loss, and I have spoken to a few survivors of suicide loss, who've lost a loved one to suicide, and they feel, sometimes, I don't want to generalize, but the few people I've spoken to can feel that they are not really given permission to mourn like everyone else. They feel in a way that that sort of shame and stigma and guilt attaches to them. No one wants to talk to them anymore. No one gives them that kind of that so societal leeway we
Absolutely.
get when we lose a loved one. Can you share a little bit of
No, I
insight on
think
that?
that you've captured the the very painful complexity of suicide loss. I think that it's a form of disenfranchised grief where you don't have societal sanction to grieve as publicly, as openly, with as much nuance as you would like to. I think because there's such a shame associated with what happened, there's so much guilt associated, survivor guilt associated with what happened. Also, certain emotions that are not permissible, like feeling anger towards the person, right? Or feeling a sense of profound regret, or even sort of feeling like, um, this constant wish to, there's this fantasy of omnipotence. I could have prevented it. I could have done something to stop it. There's also the collective stigma that comes for a family that may have experienced it, that they may have experienced loss to suicide. It's extremely difficult to make sense of. And I think society is so judgmental. I think the biggest problem that I've experienced when I'm supporting people who've lost loved ones to suicide is the judgments that they have experienced from society, but also the judgments they have internalized. Right, and the part of them that's able to separate
Yeah.
where their responsibility ended, or where their control ended, and where someone's own life sort of begins, and the decisions that they've made begins. It's very, very complex. And I think as a culture we don't allow people to experience the complexity and nuance with compassion, with empathy at all. I think people most often are not able to disclose the reason for people's deaths by suicide because there's so much stigma and shame around it. And I think I also want to add,
Yeah.
again, a point that I had made is because we believe that suicide is an individual issue, right? That it's some sort of an extension of weakness, or an extension of, or the other one, that it's only mental illness that causes suicide, or it's only weakness that causes suicide. I think it's a large, complex, multifactorial, systemic issue. Right, we cannot talk about suicide without also talking about reforms in the examination system. We can't talk about suicide without talking about reforms in agricultural policy, in debt systems, right? In We can't talk about suicide without talking about caste. So I think that it's also very lazy to talk about suicide as an individual problem, and sort of go and change the fans in quota, as opposed to talking really about the culture of academia that pushes students repeatedly, year by year, to this. So yeah.
Yeah, that sort of pressure cooker. We could actually. I mean, there's so much to talk to you about on this subject, and I hope that those of you who are listening will look up resources. You can send us questions. Get the book, please, if you want to know
Yes.
more as well. And we'll put some more of your follow up questions to Bakul when we catch it again. Just a couple more questions from me. Bakul, one of the things you talked about is nuance. As we're talking about suicide, but certainly many of the issues we've covered today, there's a layer of complexity that I feel we tend to lose, and gets glossed over. Much as I love social media and I worked for a social media company, and I get a lot of joy out of looking at Insta posts talking about mental health nowadays, but I do realize, unfortunately, it tends to also simplify, right? Because the way the algo works is both of us are going to get posts on grief for sure after posting this grief and loss. Some of them are lovely and beautiful and moving and helpful, but I want to ask about the flip side, because I think sometimes what ends up happening is we see these very sanitized kind of curated posts, and we feel like we should also be clipping along, or we have that anxiety that grows because we're not at the same place that someone else is, or we're not able to catch up. What are your thoughts broadly on social media, young mental health specifically, but also around this kind of anxiety that it's kind of creating or
Yeah.
causing?
I think that one of the most disturbing trends, there are two, three disturbing uh, sort of losses of nuance that I notice. And one is this trend towards over labeling, over diagnosis, to saying everyone is depressed, everyone has anxiety, everyone has trauma, everyone's got ADHD, everyone's got autism. And I think this is something that we started noticing happening with the pandemic, with TikTok, and young people self identifying with diagnosis. I think that became sort of a little bit of a challenge, and there's nuance that's lost there, because we are now kind of just able to Google, see symptoms, and say, okay, this is me, that's it, I have it. So the fact that mental health exists on a spectrum, and one end of the spectrum may be a disorder, a diagnosis, or pathology, or however you want to kind of uh, politically or theoretically conceptualize it. But mental health is a spectrum, and I think that nuance of that spectrum, that all of us can be at different points in that spectrum at different points in our lives, is a nuance that gets lost. So there's this huge burst of popularity with diagnostic labels, and I think that's one worrying nuance, and I would caution people against that. The second loss of nuance, I think, is in the vocabulary around healing. That healing can happen in bullet points, that healing can happen in five must do's to make sure that you are cured of whatever. The other danger, I think, with social media is that you have no way to vet the information and the source of information. So you have these healers and coaches and inner child healers, and I think there's all sorts of new categories that are bursting forth, and you may not be able to kind of really figure out. There's no way for social media to gatekeep the information that is coming to you. So the information you might be getting might be coming through an absolute charlatan, untrained, very harmful sort of way of approaching mental health. So treat the information that you get with a piece of salt, with a pinch of salt, because you don't know where it's coming from, who's giving out the information. I also want to acknowledge, though, at the other side, that information from clinical experts is not the only legitimate form of information. I don't mean to say that clinical expertise is the only truth or the only valid form of knowledge. I think that lived experience knowledge equally deserves to be amplified, have a seat at the table, and maybe even disrupt the mainstream narrative around it. But if there's anyone who's telling you that they have a 3 session formula to fix your anxiety, or a 4 session formula to fix your depression, or treat your ADHD, life is messy, life is complex, mental health is messy and complex. There is no listicle, there are no bullet points, there is no recipe as such. It is a process, and it's a process that not only mental health professionals have access over. So I think one of the worrying sort of trends I see is that mental health is now seen as a repository, or a hold only of mental health professionals. But I think mental health, before it became mental health, uh, belonged to philosophy, belonged to literature, belonged to music. It's part of the human condition. So your therapist is one source of information, avenue, knowledge, and insta therapists are one source, and that language is one way of understanding what's happening to you. But please go out and allow yourself to be, I think, allow yourself to have a richer vocabulary around mental health, right? So watch a lot of theater, watch films, watch literature, find your own vocabulary as well, because what diagnostic labels do is that they reduce us to that single story. I have depression, and that means these five things, right? But I think life is a lot more complex, and nuance is very, very important. And I also want to say that the problem, the nuance that's lost in diagnosis is that we take diagnosis at face value. Diagnosis is only descriptive. It's a statistical agreement that a bunch of professionals came at to be able to communicate with each other. It's not a description of what the person is going through, right? So I think a pinch of salt when we look at ADHD, autism, anxiety, these are the ones that I think people are kind of picking up very sort of quickly on social media and saying, oh, I have this. So I think also go into the science of diagnosis. The science of diagnosis and diagnostic classification is very young. It's a very new, raw, not very mature science. So it's evolving. Every couple of years
Yeah.
we evolve it. So
Yeah.
don't identify yourself with a label.
I love that. Don't diagnose yourself just on the basis of what you're hearing or seeing, or don't diagnose each other. I've seen this also happen where you kind of try to diagnose your friends and stuff. And also, we're so much more than just that one or two label, the one or two
Absolutely,
labels,
absolutely.
as you said. Akul, I really appreciate your wisdom, your insight, your sharing from your lived experience as much as your clinical expertise. We have to have a follow up chat, hopefully in person one day. Thank you so much for being on
Thank
this
you, Amrita.
podcast.